I want to talk a little bit about the project I'm doing right now. I was invited by Hackett Publishers some years ago to
There is
publish
Wyatt.
in English translations of the letters of King Afonso Mbimbanzinga, which I'd spent a lot of time sort of saying, I don't really want to do this. But fortunately, I decided eventually that I would go ahead and do that because Afonso is such a well-known character, probably the best-known historical Congo character, of all the kings and so on that we know so much about. He's the one that has the public imagination. And so we were also really fortunate to get Luis Madureira to be the translator. So I didn't have to try to translate that archaic Portuguese into English and hope I got it right. I had somebody who really knows 16th century Portuguese as well. I guess one of the surprises for me when I started this project was I had sort of assumed that Afonso would write Portuguese in a sort of a creolized way, and that I was hoping we might discover in these texts calques. A calque in linguistics is where a person speaking a language other than his own uses idioms or sentence constructions or even vocabulary items which are more appropriate to his own culture than it is to the culture in which he's speaking the language. What Luis tells me, though, was that, in fact, Congo, the Portuguese, if we look at 16th century Portuguese, the Portuguese in which Afonso's letters are written is actually extremely erudite and very much in terms of native idiom, native Portuguese idiom. And that this search for calques that I had in mind was wrong. And I have to say also that part of the reason that we hear this, I think Georges Prolondier started saying this, was in fractured Portuguese, and people said his language was clearly, sort of a novice language, is because the author of his language, almost all of his letters, the ones that are the most important, the ones that we know, were written by his secretary, who was a man named João Teixeira. João Teixeira was himself Congolese. He went to Lisbon to study, I think probably in 1491, 1492, he would have gotten back there. And he would have, at that point, been at the age where you can learn a second language with native proficiency. So he was probably maybe 10 or 11 years old. We know that many of the students who went to Portugal in those days to study were what they call moços in Portuguese, which is typically a sort of an adolescent. Have to be old enough to be able to sustain themselves through that long ocean voyage, but young enough to be able to acquire proficiency. And that was actually something that contemporary sources talking about doing. So João Teixeira probably is responsible for the native qualities of Afonso's letters. But this was, to me, was a surprise. I have to say I sort of fell into the unconscious category of imagining that this was sort of a person who wasn't very sophisticated, when in fact he was incredibly sophisticated. That's just really kind of the beginning of the process. So I often ask myself, well, what do people know about Afonso? And one of the things I have to say is that if I go to Mbanza Congo and I ask about Afonso, they're likely to say, well, he was the man who buried his mother alive. And you probably know that proverb and the story that goes with it, about his mother would take off an idol that she was wearing around her neck, and he begged her to do it, and he pleaded her to do it, and then finally, when she wouldn't do it, he felt obliged to bury her alive. And that story is an interesting story, but that's probably where he's best known if we think about the traditional milieu. I mean, people can correct me and say, well, no, there's more to it than that, but that certainly is one of the things. And I first located that story in a text from 1685. And it's completely not true. I mean, we need to say that right away. Jean Cuvelier demonstrated that it wasn't true way back in 1946 when he published his biography of Afonso, which was actually just called L'Ancien Royaume du Congo. But it was really just a biography of Afonso. And he shows that contemporary records reveal that Afonso's mother was far from that, and that she was buried. I mean, we don't know for sure that she wasn't buried alive, but it seems quite likely that story wasn't circulating when Mateus Cardoso wrote about these events and mentioned her burial place in the church of Nossa Senhora de Victoria in Mbanza Congo, or San Salvador as it was in those days. And so the story came up after that, and it goes through, I found about 10 or 15 different, maybe 10 different variations on the story in writing from 1685 up till the retelling of it that Tiago Sapegi, a Brazilian PhD student, now PhD, he also heard the story in 2017 when he was in Banza Congo doing field research. The cultural king, I guess, said that this story about the mother being buried alive, and it has an amazing set of variations and so on. But I think for most people outside of the Congo milieu, he's probably best known for his slave trade letters, the 3 letters that he wrote in 1526 denouncing the slave trade. And so that's probably the second most knowledgeable thing that we have about him. Also, he has a funny and interesting sort of reputation in, let's say, academic circles, or in the days when Alfonso was actually a part of the school curriculum in the United States. He's actually illustrated in some textbooks that I found in the days when that was popular in the 1970s and 80s. Nowadays, apparently, Africa has disappeared from U.S. curriculum pretty much completely. I used to, in the old days, I used to survey my students in my Africa survey class and ask them how many had, done anything in their K through 12 education with regards to Africa, not even Congo, pre-colonial Africa, and I get blanks. And in the 80s, I used to get people that knew a few things, and if they did, they probably knew about Afonso. In any case, I would say that the story we got out of that one came pretty much as reinterpreted from Basil Davidson's account from the early 1960s, which presented Afonso as being a little bit of a dupe, a person who sort of got to be too much committed to Christianity and not enough recognizing the perfidy of the Portuguese. It was too trusting of them. I had one person I remember during my education say, well, this was the guy who was too willing to accept foreign aid, and that Africans needed to, find their own way beyond that. So the one thing I'm doing with this edition is I'm also writing a biography of him. I think when it's printed, it'll probably be about 100 or 150 pages long. So I consider that a full biography. And then the letters themselves take up quite a bit. He has 22 letters. Some of them are quite short, but a good many of them are fairly long. And his letter of 5th October 1514, which is pretty well known, I think it runs about 20 pages in print. So it's a lot to be said. The other thing I think most people don't realize is that the history of the Kingdom of Congo between 1483 and about 1550 or so is almost entirely written by Congo authored sources. There are a handful of visitors' accounts, but they tend to run 1 page, 2 pages. There are some documents and so on that were written by Portuguese living in the Kingdom of Congo, but by far the largest amount of material that we work in, and the material that's been the most relevant, was actually written by Congolese authors. This doesn't just include the letters of King Alfonso, but also quite a few letters of his successor, Diogo I. And also Diogo I is responsible for the legal inquest into the treason plot against him in 1550, which has a whole set of testimony from Congolese people concerning the terms and nature of this plot. And that in itself is one of the most informative documents about Congo political organization, because people are talking about getting appointments and getting incomes and facing trials and so on. All of that kind of thing is in the midst of that trial inquest. And that one, Linda Haywood, my wife and I, we didn't translate that one. Louis did as well. We published that in English and Portuguese. It was published earlier, of course, several times, but we did an English translation, which appeared in a book called Afro-Latino Voices. And it's a pretty interesting record. And I actually introduced that to a group of 6th grade teachers in Maryland back in the late 90s. And they actually made a game out of it in which the people were playing role playing for school kids in sixth grade, role playing the idea of how political power would be organized by family factions, basically. And so that was another part of this process. So anyway, in writing the biography, I wanted to take on a couple projects or questions which I thought were relevant. And one of these was the question of exactly how much of a role he played in developing Christianity in Congo. And it's increasingly clear to me that he did play a fundamental role in institutionalizing the church. He was very strategic about how he did this. We don't just see that in his correspondence, but also in other things that sort of swirl around this thing. And I guess the other thing I would have to say is that understanding to what degree the Christian church in Congo developed as a Congolese project and not as a Portuguese project. The tendency is to imagine, and I think many of us, think this way, that we're talking about a colonial situation. Most people who have knowledge of the colonial period, the recent colonial period in Africa, have a vision of how missionaries function. You have a missionary who's a very authoritarian figure. He's the authority on everything that's going on. He monitors people's behavior, and he maybe will allow people to be his catechists. And that's sort of the way the thing works. It's very much centered on the European missionary. And in fact, it really didn't work that way at all. The clergy did not play, European clergy did not play a particularly strong role in the development of the church, nor in the propagation of Christianity in the Kingdom of Congo. That was very much a project that was in the hands of the king. And it's significant, I think, that when we think about it that way, that we realize this is why it took root the way it did, and why it was so tenacious in the country, that this what starts in the 16th century is still very much evident in the middle of the 19th century. And it's because it's of the formation of the local church. And this, I think, is probably where we see Alfonso at his most vigorous, and in the end, not successful from what he had in mind, but quite successful for the larger picture. So to go back to the beginning here, Congo entered into relations with Portugal in a very deliberate way. His father, Zingaku, João I, was also very much interested in this project. He sent a mission to Lisbon, which arrived in 1486. That mission was the immediate predecessor to the conversion of the King of Congo. It was led by a senior official in the Congo kingdom. Not sure exactly what his position was. I have deciphered his name as Kalakamfusu. That's just a kind of a guess. His written in the oldest manuscript we have of this in Italian, and I tried to figure out how I could make that saying that out loud and listening to myself and saying, how can I make this into Kikongo? And that's what I came up with, Kalakamfusu. I'm not even sure. It doesn't sound like a real name to me, but anyway, that's what I did. He was the leader, and this group had a number of nobles and also a number of moços, those young children. They stayed 4 years in Lisbon. During that time, they learned to speak Portuguese, and they also taught Kikongo to one of the priests who was their sort of go-between, a man named Vicente dos Anjos. And Vicente dos Anjos, in his little mini biography that was written many years later, but based on his now lost post-mortem biography, says that he was the one who taught them through the science of language. It says ciência da língua. Not sure exactly how that works out in English, and through the science of language, he was the one that taught them the mysteries of the Holy Faith. So I'm envisioning, of course, these are people exchanging language knowledge, and they're also trying to figure out how to make the spiritual vocabulary of Kikongo into a spiritual vocabulary of Portuguese, and vice versa, and what kind of discussions they might have had. Well, we don't know what those were like. And unfortunately, we don't really have any idea of how that worked out linguistically until we get to the Catechism of 1624, which is many, many years after these events. It's enough to say that the editor, Mateus Cardoso, of that catechism, was conscious that there was already a spiritual vocabulary in place. And there were things that he wanted to modify and change based on what he'd already met there. So I think that was a big part of the process. In any case, they brought this back with them. And it's significant to say because the few accounts that we have of Congo that are written by Europeans are almost certainly informed by this group of people. The most important of those is Louis de Pinas's account, which was written in 1492. In which he gives the sort of official version of what happened. And the inclination that we might have to imagine is sort of the naive report of an arriving European or Europeans. Louis de Pinas wasn't there. He interviewed people. He said he interviewed 6 people. But it was very likely informed by this group of people who had come to Portugal and who were there in a position to both know Portugal and know Portuguese culture. You spend 4 years in Lisbon, you're going to learn a lot about Portuguese culture. These are the people who really the intermediaries, and they're ones who are responsible for the information in those early accounts. Okay, so anyway, we're fast forwarding a little bit. The Xingankou takes on the church. Alfonso tells us the story of the end of Xingankou. His letter, a letter which reached Lisbon probably in 1508. Is lost, but the historian João de Barros clearly used it as one of his primary sources when he wrote the account of Alfonso's secession, including the famous battle with his brother. And that account is a fairly lengthy one. I can't say for sure because we don't have the original, but I think that de Barros probably borrowed quite heavily from it. It has some things which are quite unusual in it. One of the stories that he tells is that Alfonso's father was concerned that Alfonso had been using the special powers that Christianity gave him to engage in plots and so on. And one of these things was that that Alfonso was able to fly every night from Sundi to Matokongo in order to sleep with the wives of his father. And so in order to test this, Xingankou created an idol, a fetish, right? Which he said would protect the wife from this happening. And so they delivered it to the wife, and she didn't know anything about it. She said, what are you talking about? And this was what redeemed Alfonso. But what's interesting is her name is Kufakamfulu. Kufakamfulu, which I translate as the death of a place or the destruction of a place. Remembering in the 16th century, verbs still had the infinitive prefix ku. They lost that in the early 18th century, so you don't use that anymore. But I said, well, now this is not a personal name that most people would get, but what the heck does it mean? Where exactly are we going with this? And certainly, she's the kind of person you can imagine might be dabbling in the occult, to say the least. To me, it's a kind of a myth. What's interesting is that João de Barros picks this up. His spelling of the word is really explicit. You don't have any problems at making it into Kikongo. You don't have to twist letters or change things out. It's just right there. He doesn't know what it means. That's clear. It's just a personal name to him. Anyway, this is sort of the thing that comes out of that letter. And it's hard to believe that this letter isn't the work of João Teixeira or somebody who was really cognizant of that. In any case, that conversion part was important. And then when Alfonso gets into office, he's now very deliberate. What they began doing is taking the people who had studied in Lisbon and creating schools where they would be teachers. And then these schools in turn produced people who would be school teachers themselves, and they started sending them out. And we see that by 1520 or 1530, there's a comprehensive web of those folks. And an Inquisition case from the 1580s, a priest who had served in Congo said that they don't do any catechism work themselves. That's all done by local men, members of the nobility, who are masters de schola, school teachers. And so the clergy, the European clergy that were in Africa, were not actually teaching at all. This was all done by that local set of community people. What exactly they were teaching and how they were teaching it would be a fascinating question to ask about, but right now we don't really have enough information to be able to say. But it's pretty clear that this was undoubtedly shaped in a way that shows up in the 1624 Catechism. There wasn't a catechism until 1557, and that catechism was allegedly written by a man named Diogo Gomes. So Diogo Gomes, according to his biography, was born in the Kingdom of Congo of Portuguese parents. And the chronicler who tells us this, Baltasar Teles, says, it makes a point of saying both his mother and his father were from the Kingdom of Congo. This is a man who became a Jesuit. My guess is that he wasn't a Portuguese like that. He was a mestizo, and his mother was probably Congolese and of high birth. But the Jesuits didn't want to make that public because they had a significant prejudice against people who weren't of 100% European ancestry. And I think the point that he made, it was father and mother, just kind of a flag to me. Anyway, Diogo Gomes produces this. His story is a whole nother story, which I'm not going to go into. All right, so in any case, that's the way in which Christianity becomes developed. Now, Alfonso was not content with just having his own people in charge of the proselytization. He also wanted to have a full-fledged Catholic Church in his country, which meant he hoped and expected that he would get the elite members of his clergy to become bishops, and then the bishops in turn to be able to what do you call it? Sacralize the Mestres de Scola, and they would become the regular clergy, the secular clergy that would run the country. And to that project, he did quite a bit to try to develop people who could study Latin. Latin was being taught in Congo in those days. We have interesting. I mean, toward the end of the 16th century, we have accounts of missionaries who are teaching Latin in schools in Soyo. They testify for the Inquisition in that same case I mentioned before. So again, we know that kind of thing was going on. And his hope was that he would get his own bishop. Well, he did in a way, which is that his son Henrique became the titular bishop of Utica. There wasn't a see of the Kingdom of Congo. And he was ordained in 1518, became a full bishop in 1521. And we don't know much about what he did there, but presumably he did, in fact, start creating a local clergy, although the documentary record is not sufficiently strong for us to know how many they were or what that was about. Unfortunately, Alfonso was thwarted. I think the Portuguese crown was surprised, as we all are in a way, the speed with which the church developed in Congo. It was amazing speed, really, and the commitment that went with it. But they figured by the 1520s or so they could capitalize on this. And so the question of the bishop came up. When Henrique died in 1531, there was then the possibility of would there become a see of the Kingdom of Congo that would have its own bishop. And Alfonso was clearly lining up for that. He had written a whole plan to have 2 bishops and X number of clergy in each of his parishes, and he was even starting to sort of vet people who would hold these positions. Most of them were people who were his nephews, whatever that might mean in a Portuguese text, or whatever that would mean in Kikongo. Which the kinship terminology is different, to say the least. But the King of Portugal managed to maneuver the Pope in Rome to declare São Tomé, the island which Portugal controlled, to be the seat of the bishop, and Congo was to be then suffragan on that seat. And the bishop proceeded to abuse his power in ways that were predictable in that day and time. So Alfonso didn't win, and ultimately, even though Congo did eventually win an episcopal see, they never managed to get it outside of the control of Portugal. And for that reason, they never managed to develop what Alfonso had always dreamed of, which was a regular church with bishops and a clergy appointed by the bishops and all of that. That didn't happen. So they ended up with this structure that was sort of half and half. To get regular clergy, the Portuguese deprived them of clergy, sent them very few priests. They ended up, maneuvering what they could in Rome, and they got Capuchin priests to come, not to serve as missionaries exactly, but to serve as secular, sort of parish priests. not what their mission was, as the Capuchins understood it. That's a whole nother story, which is taking us outside of Alfonso. So that's sort of the first thing I wanted to sort of bring out, which I think will come out in this book. I've been saying this for a long time, but it's always helpful to say things multiple times to get people to listen. And so, this is the story that will come up again. And I think the significance, though, for people who are more interested in, say, the later periods in Congo history, is to understand how Christianity became a local church in Congo, and that it was definitely grown up in and around and through the existing Congo cosmological conceptions and so on that went with it. And I'm arguing, and I've started to argue, that this is why Congolese Christians play a big role in the propagation of Christianity in the Americas, which we see in the 18th century in particular, when large numbers of Congolese are now being exported in the slave trade, which is not so much true in earlier periods. Which then brings me to the second question, which is why I forgot to silence my phone. It's my daughter calling me from England, but I'll put her on aside. She'll get over it. Anyway, so to go back to this, the second thing I wanted to talk about was the question of Alfonso and the slave trade. So this is a really interesting question, because many people are aware of these 3 letters that Alfonso wrote in 1526, complaining about the Portuguese interfering in his country in ways that promoted the slave trade. And those letters are the only letters that Alfonso's have actually been translated into English. And they're not completely translated, but they're translated well enough to get the point. And obviously, they're also presented to the American public, and I'm speaking of American public now, without any context, or without any thorough context. And back in 1981, I published an article in an academic journal, History in Africa, in which I made a contention that these did not involve the Kingdom of Congo, but rather contestations between the Portuguese and Alfonso over the question of who was going to proselytize and also exploit the Kingdom of Ndongo, which would become the root of the Kingdom of the Portuguese colony of Angola. And when you line up all the texts, it's pretty clear that he's talking about that region. It's not just that one set of letters that lays it up for us. We see that the Portuguese sent a mission to Ndongo in the 1520s. That mission failed, but Alfonso actually retrieved the missionary that was sent and brought him to Banza Congo. And then he in turn went back to Portugal from there. And that he had been, as it turns out, there had been a sword fight in the church in the capital of Ndongo between some group of Portuguese. I think these were probably people loyal to São Tomé, and the missionaries, or somebody involved in that. Sword play sounds pretty serious, especially in a church. The king had ordered the church torn down. So that event took place in 1526. And Alfonso, if you've read these letters, you're familiar with the letters, he speaks of it as if the kingdom is in a stark state of anarchy, that people are stealing their parents and their families, and that members of the royal family maybe have even been kidnapped and sold into slavery. It's interesting because, first of all, it's pretty clear that Alfonso didn't have any difficulties at all in the earlier part of his reigns with selling slaves to Europeans. He makes lots of arrangements for that. He's concerned about paying taxes on them. There's a whole set of other things that go on with this. And then suddenly we have this blast of letters. Well, first to say that Alfonso wrote many more letters than we have. Unfortunately, the earthquake and fire in the Lisbon archives destroyed thousands and thousands of records. We know from records in the existing correspondence that he wrote letters that we don't have the context for now, and he probably wrote many more than that. So we're kind of stuck with having a gap in the record. Plus, even the European sources have this gap that's problematic in the records that we're dealing with. But in any case, it's fairly clear that one of the things that was going on was that traders from São Tomé were going to Angola, and they were circumventing a right which Alfonso claimed he had, and the Portuguese crown acknowledged, which was the right to control all trade coming out of his portion of the African coast. And the arrangement was made with the kings of Portugal. The understanding was that the Portuguese crown would get a monopoly on their side, and he would get a monopoly on his side in the trade of that region. The settlers in São Tomé, however, were sort of squeezed out of that. And the crown wanted to be the supplier of the slaves to São Tomé. The Tomistas, the people living there, obviously wanted their own supply. And this is a long and complicated story, but it ends up in Angola, where the Portuguese from São Tomé began pioneering this trade. So anyway, the bottom line is, I think what happened is that the one strong position, the one where you might find members of the royal family in that area, was in the island of Luanda. And the island of Luanda was significant because it produced Zimbu shells. So Congo had a strong strategic interest in having that place garrisoned. And they were definitely concerned that Ndongo was spreading into this region, and that it was likely to be able to do something dangerous to that island. And I have a feeling it was war involved in that. I can't prove it, but I think that was the background to this case. Interestingly enough, the third of his letters, after he's made this denunciation, Alfonso suddenly presents a program where, okay, we're going to continue the slave trade after all, but I want to have 3 officials in charge of it. 2 of them will be royal officials appointed by the King of Congo, and 1 will be a Portuguese. The Portuguese guy would happen to be chosen from the residents in Congo, who would probably be pretty loyal to Alfonso as well. And that was going to be the supervision of the trade. And again, he doesn't specify where this is going to be, but I have a feeling it'll be in Luanda. And it will be sort of checking out on the primary route to São Tomé, which is to the valley of the Kwanza River. It's interesting, though, that in 1531, and these are documents I discovered in the archive, which have never been used, sort of the 1 or 2 little places where I have something that's really new to put in. The Portuguese crown did have a factor right there in 1531. And so I think what happened here is Alfonso says, we're going to control this. And the King of Portugal says, no, we'll control this. And again, this is a place where Alfonso got a little bit outmaneuvered. But that's sort of the situation that we get with that process. So those are the 2 things that I think are probably the most controversial of Alfonso's life. I mean, there's many other things that we could get into. I think I will say that I do not accept also the idea that was just been fairly widely presented, that the Portuguese did a lot that he was sort of a puppet of the Portuguese, that they put him in office and that they protected him against his enemies, and they helped him to try to consolidate and so on his power and the throne, or that he wasn't really a legitimate king and so on. Again, all of that stuff I'm not prepared to accept. One of the things I did take a look at a little bit more closely was the famous battle in which he waged against his brother. So for people who are not 100% familiar with this, Alfonso faced a rival to his throne when he became king. And he had his supporters in the capital, and his brother had his supporters as well. And Alfonso was away in Nsundi, and when he heard his father was ill, he decided to go to the capital, which was probably wise. And then when he got relatively close to the capital, his father died. His mother sent him a message telling him that his father was dead. He should come right away if he wanted to be king. So he arrived in time, and he found himself really short of supporters. According to his correspondence, he had 37 men to fight on his side, and his brother had a massive army, and he was able to defeat the army with the assistance of St. James the Greater and the Virgin Mary, a powerful combination on the battlefield. So I took a look at that account, the account of Pigafetta, who would have known about it many years afterwards, but probably would have known something of the geography of it. And I tried to figure out, how could you have 37 people to defeat a large army, aside from the help from the Virgin Mary? And it's not difficult to figure that out if you've ever been to Mbanza Congo. So Mbanza Congo, you know how you come to the mountain on the road, and you take this road up the side of the mountain. It's really the only way to get up the side on that side is on that road. And it's very steep, and all around it are sheer cliffs. I experimented with that. I threw a rock, and yes, it went all the way to the ground, which must have been at least, 100 meters. It was a long way. You don't want to fall off the edge of the mountain. People who know Mbanza Congo will tell you, yeah, that's not what you want to have happen. So the only way you can approach it is up that road. And we know that at the top of that road, where it enters into the city, there was a fortress. Dopper's map, or Dopper's engraving of the city, shows it as a castle. It probably wasn't that at the time of Alfonso, but undoubtedly, if you look at the position of that place, this is the logical place to put some sort of fortification. So essentially what Alfonso did, yes, he had 37 men. So what men meant in his day would have been people that the Portuguese called adugueiros. These would be highly skilled, noble soldiers who fought with sword and were covered with a shield. And so most armies would have a relatively small number of these highly trained people who were their primary shock troops, surrounded by a large mass of people who mostly were there to shoot arrows at each other. And so again, if you look at the text carefully, Alfonso has these 37 men, but he also has a lot of other followers who at one point are so frightened they run into the royal palace to hide, and then they're persuaded to come out, and they come and they support him. And these are the archers around him. So I'm thinking what happened is that Alfonso confronts his brother's first rank of soldiers coming up, and they're repelled. Actually, the accounts say they repelled him 3 times. And then his brother tried to go up on a side angle, and Alfonso rushed over to that side and redeployed, you might say. And it was there where they had the battle. The brother was defeated. His troops retreated back through the oncoming ranks and created a panic against all of them, and then they all fled, and that's the end of the story. So it's more complicated than that, but also it gives us a good vision as to how that battle was waged. There was a speculation that the mounted knights that appeared in Afonso's vision, or the vision of his opponents, were Portuguese cavalry that had somehow been brought up on that mountaintop. There's no evidence for anything like that. Horses don't survive in northern Angola for a very long time. They probably would have had to be there for quite a while, and they would have died. So I don't think there's any cavalry in it. The spectral cavalry, I think, is just exactly that. It's spectral. As for the Portuguese support for him, there's really actually not much indication that the Portuguese gave him a lot of support. When he went to battle in 1512 or so against Munza, who was a Kimbundu-speaking subject of his, who he says rebelled, there were 9 Portuguese that went to assist him. None of them were people that we even begin to describe as people with great military experience. One of them complained constantly of not having enough to eat, finally had to go back home. You know, that I don't think that's going to make enough of a difference to be counted as Portuguese support. They fought. He does account that in the 1520s he'd been fighting against Panzalungu, a place that's a little bit mysterious, but I've identified as being on the south shore of the Congo River in Soyo, or near Soyo, and that it took him a long time to subdue that area. And he says that both white men and black died in the wars against Panzalungu. So he did have Portuguese soldiers in his army. Whether they were decisive enough to make him able to win his victories is difficult to say. I don't think that he did a great deal in terms of concentrating power that wouldn't have been already present in the kingdom. And I think that mostly what he was doing was he did fight wars all the time, but these wars were external to the country. And to the degree that Congo participated in the slave trade, most of it would have been from those exterior wars. So not anything that happened within the Kingdom of Congo, unlike later in the history of the Congo, where as I said, the Kingdom of Congo ate itself alive. But I'm speaking of the 18th century here, not the 16th century. All right, I'm going to stop about here because I think I would like to answer questions, and maybe there's things that people would like to bring up that I haven't talked about, and we can go from there.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John. Just friends, it is your time to ask questions. You can either write them in the chat or just ask to John directly.
I see I have 5 messages in chat. Let's see what's there. Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, actually, that's mostly complaints about people coming in without turning off their mic, or without muting their mic. So nothing to be said.
Okay. Just have Tom's question. Somebody a question?
Question.
Dr. Johnson.
Yes, the killing the mother, King's mother, is a theme that is sort of routine, and it's part of a wider narrative about cutting blood ties in order to establish social order. And I've seen it used in Sundi enclaves north of the Congo River, where they have to establish exogamy, that is intermarriage, because the community is totally Sundi. So they cut the blood with the sacrifice of a goat or a pig, and so in the idea of the inauguration of a powerful chief, or to create a powerful office, you have to separate that individual from family. And so what better way than to kill your mother, except that probably substitutionary sacrifice like a goat or a pig would stand in for the mother. Just like in the cutting of the blood ties in the Sundi enclave, they cut the blood with a goat. Comment.
Good point. Yeah, good point. The same issue with mothers comes up in the later versions of the founding of the Kingdom of Congo. So in Mateus Cardoso's version of the history, the founding king, he calls Lucani, it kills his mother. And then I think in the version of Bernardo de Gallo, it's one of his aunts, and he also stabs her through the womb, so thereby killing the baby. That's the Cavazzi's version. Sorry, there's 4 or 5 versions of this that come from the 17th century. And yeah, I think that these are probably not to be taken literally, let's put it that way. And establishing actually, when I posed this question in Luanda, and interpret that as meaning that the king had so much power that no one was free from his power, and they proposed that was a possible reading of it, but that they thought another reading of it was that a community related thing, and I'm not blanking on exactly how they put it, but I'm sure that this is another one has her, he prepares a place for her to sit, and there's a pit underneath it, and she sits on the seat. That's another one that we find widespread in Central Africa as well.
Interest.
Oh, now Bruno had a question. Go ahead.
Hi, Thorton. Hi, all. I have many questions, Thorton, and my thoughts from long time in Banza Congo and people that I've interviewed there. And first of all, it's a pleasure to be here and to listen to you and to listen to Magafi when I read the next, and everybody. It's an honor for me. And okay, I have 3 questions. I don't know if I will do the 3 now but the first one, and when I was reading the letters of Afonso in Brazil, Monumenta, the question that I was asking myself were if it was really written by him, or if it was a Portuguese priest or a Congolese Portuguese trained person, like that wrote for him, and in the moment that he just signed it, or even he was not signing at all. So that I ask you, if there is a direct mention that is really him that wrote the letters?
No, my contention was it was João Teixeira. João Teixeira signs on the bottom of his letters. There's a notation. Kings don't write their own letters. The King of Spain didn't write his own letters. The secretary writes the letter. The king maybe dictates it, or edits it or something, but that's the way those things work. I don't know what Afonso's command of Portuguese was, but I'm pretty sure that João Teixeira had native proficiency, and he was certainly not. He was a person that Afonso trusted. In his letter, he specifically states that. He says that he doesn't trust anybody else around him, but he trusts this guy, João Teixeira. And then when you look at all of his letters, you see João Teixeira's right through to 1540, at which place he's now Don João Teixeira. So presumably he was a person who was ennobled along the way from his role.
Okay. My second question is, your books and your presentation today depicts the situation of a Christian Afonso and a development of a local version of the church. Right? Mm-hmm. In the current Banza Congo, there is a sign in the front of Columbimbi that clearly values the place as a Christian heritage. In the interviews that I've done with many local churches, the Kimbanguis, Tocois, Impadis, Gondois, and BDK, and others, they all have a very negative view of the Afonso, linked to the death of the mother, of course, but more than this, the beginning of the colonial times and the decline of the Congo culture. Considering that you are leading an influential scholar of the Congo and even participated in the discussion of the World Heritage, now how do you see these conflict narratives and how to manage it, considering that there is a political and social dimensions in the city itself for these different narratives?
Yeah, well, I can't say that I have as much experience as you do, Bruno, in Banza Congo itself, but my impressions of just being there a couple of times and staying a week one time was that people are very much divided over the question of, Afonso and what his role is in Congo. And some people are very proud of him and others, as you say, shares that thing. And it does seem to be a sectarian issue, which is, I think, a lot of the independent church members have adopted the position that the Kingdom of Congo was somehow a colony of Portugal and that the missionaries were doing this as they understood the colonial church to be. And there's no question that the Angolan colonial church was an instrument of colonialism. I mean, that's a given. And so people responding to that, and it was also interested in suppressing indigenous culture, including even languages. Congos have, by and large, resisted that, unlike the Kimbundas, as anybody in Congo will tell you over and over again. The Kimbundas all learned to speak Portuguese, forgot their own language, but Congos never forgot their language. And it's true. You walk around the streets in Luanda, even if you go in the hinterland, people are speaking Portuguese. Little kids are throwing rocks at each other and they're speaking in Portuguese. You don't see that in Banza Congo. You walk down the street, people are speaking Kikongo. And if they find out you speak 2 words of Kikongo, they won't speak to you in Portuguese. So, that's the reality. But having said that, that's a mistake. I mean, it's quite simple. This is not a colonial church. These missionaries are not colonial missionaries. This is a place where the country's in charge. The king is in charge. Obviously, many people living today receive their education through the Portuguese. The Portuguese wrote the textbooks that people got in schools. Their vision of Afonso was that he was sort of a handmaiden of colonialism, that he was like the local chef de posto, not the chef de posto, the local soba, and somebody else, Manuel Pacheco was often chosen to be that person, was the chef de posto. Well, that's, of course, complete historical nonsense, and it's a creation of the Portuguese colonial regime. So people reacting against that are likely to look at a collaborator. They see Afonso as a collaborator that way, just as they see the traditional church, Christian church, as an instrument of colonialism. And not surprisingly, the independent churches in particular are going to reject that. I think that's probably where we get this idea. And it's true that Afonso has this ambiguous reputation. But what's always struck me about Banza Congo is that first and foremost and above everything else, they're proud of Congo. This is not something new. The Portuguese were always usually talking about the Musi Congos arrogantes or orgulhosos. They think that, that when God created the world, he took his own time to create the Kingdom of Congo and gave his angels out to create the rest of the world. That's something that was already present in the 16th century. So it's nothing new, to say the least. That's sort of, the amazing pride of the Congo people. And any sort of smirch on that is a problem. I've always compared Congos to Americans. Americans don't mind that people hate us because we know we're the greatest anyway, right? So they're just fools for thinking so. And that's kind of the attitude I get from Congo-speaking people in Angola, at least. I don't have that much experience in DRC.
Okay, in the last question is going the direction that you appointed about the education. And because one thing that really get me when I was in Banza Congo, that in the Kimpa Vita library, it has almost all your books there, right? But when we see the cover pages that registers how many times a book was borrowed, I saw that your books were less borrowed than the colonial racist books that was several times borrowed. Yeah, that shows for me that the knowledge of the academia is not getting to the local people, as you say. And so how can we improve this, right? Because to change this situation that connects, you have the view. That's a question that I did myself also when I was doing my field work there.
Oh, I think the best solution is to translate my work into Portuguese. I have a feeling that most people are not looking at a book written in English. And I mean, that's just the kind of the bottom line. I'd be happy with French. As far as I can see from Banza Congo, everybody speaks both languages. When I was there, they asked me to speak alternate paragraphs in Portuguese and French, which I found absolutely impossible. In fact, I completely forgot both languages in the process of doing that, and then had to stop, and take a 2-minute break and say, "Look, you get one or the other, but you don't get both." Not from me, anyway. I'm sure people in Banza Congo can do that all the time, but not me. So I think that would be, I would love to see my work translated, or alternatively, people who do research in that work and who can write fluently in Portuguese and French to do that. That's where I hope I would be more influential. I keep hoping that, I'll get a translation offer from somebody somewhere, but that didn't happen. At least it hasn't happened yet. And I would encourage people that think my work is worth translating into Portuguese that, you can publish books in Angola. There's a reasonably active press once the thing gets in the right language.
Okay. Thank you.
Wyatt has a question. Do I have to answer that one? You're muted, Wyatt. You're muted. Wyatt, you're muted. You think you'll read the chat? Yeah.
Can you hear me
there we
now?
go.
Yes,
Okay.
I can hear you.
I don't want to make a comment, a question. I just want to endorse what you said right at the beginning. I say you have to keep saying the same thing in hope of persuading people. Most people are comfortable with the ideas that their heads are already stuffed with, right? And they resist anything that requires them to do any rethinking, right? That applies all over, not just in Banza Congo and Afonso.
Well, I don't know if I would state it quite that strongly, but it is true that it's difficult to say something different from the existing narrative and have that easily accepted. I've often said that anybody writing African history for an American audience has to prove every point that makes Africans look good at least 3 times,
right,
before it's acceptable. And the same thing I have to say, which I find an amazing amount of resistance to, is the idea that the Congolese who were enslaved that came to the New World were not Catholics. I've seen them called semi-Christians or had some Christian background, or it wasn't like that. I mean, people who visited the place, they said, these people make great pride of being Christians. This is the most important thing they're talking about. And all the people around them who aren't Christians are inferior. I mean, not to say too many bad things about Congos, but Congos tend to believe that anyway. And so it's not difficult to say whatever we have in Congo society is better than what people have around us. And yet we still have people that will not, really latch onto this idea. I published an article on Paulo Monte in Cuba in 2016, which I made an explicit claim that the saints that show up in these various syncretic American religions, Voodoo and Santeria and Shango and so on, Candomblé, the saints come from the Kingdom of Congo. They don't come from the Portuguese or the Spanish church. And it's really clear that in the New World, those churches weren't doing any missionizing. They weren't. They weren't. The Inquisition wasn't bothering anybody. And so where do the saints come from? And that's what I'm trying to contend. And I find that is an idea that's not easily accepted.
Yes, you've got question there.
Oh, okay.
John. Just,
Yes,
people-
yeah. Well,
Unmute yourself, yeah.
uh-huh.
Yes, yes. I'm sorry, but I just took the name of my wife. Actually, I am Nika Vianga. I am descendant of Vembazinga, who ruled the Congo Empire
Question.
for Christianity.
Yeah, maybe you can write your question. We can.
And on my father's side and on my mother's side, I am the descendant of Sakunevunda, who's considered the main figure of love in the Congo tradition.
Okay. I didn't understand a
The
single word.
concern is that I would like, first of all, to
If somebody heard,
my question
Yeah.
is to Mr. John Thornton, that what is the inspiration of about the yeah, I don't know if you're following me.
No.
Can you hear
I don't think
me?
at all.
Just can you write your question because we cannot hear you. Please write your question in the chat, please.
Yes.
Can you
No,
have
no.
him to write it?
Are you following me?
No, write your question in the chat, please. We cannot hear you.
Are you following me?
No. Est-ce que
Are you following me?
No. Est-ce que vous pouvez écrire votre question? Hein, parce qu'on ne t'entend pas. OK?
Is there
S'il vous plaît, tenta escrever a sua pergunta. E o som está vindo com muito cortes e não está a ser bem ouvido.
Pode escrever em português ou em francês?
Sim, pode escrever em português ou francês. John Thornton fala inglês, português e francês.
I am unmuted?
Hey, I have an appointment at 12 to pick up 2 phones.
What's your last name?
Gondola.
Okay, I think you can write your question. Just let us move to another person because time is this.
Gondola.
Oui,
Spell that.
Professor Gondola.
Gondola.
Oui, Professeur Gondola, vous avez une question, je crois.
Very classic gondola, but it's not gondola.
You're okay.
It's a gondola.
Adrian, please ask him to mute himself. He's talking to someone else.
Can you hear me?
Hello, please guys, just mute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Non, ne parle plus parce que là, vraiment, ça dérange. Okay, don't speak anymore because it's disturbing us, okay?
Tata Adriano.
Yes.
Maleve.
Kamba kasonika kiuvu kadi matumpasi.
Matumbati,
C'est ça, thank you. Just John, just maybe you can just deal with another question. Just please write your question.
Okay, well, Diane Stewart had a question for me that's in the chat. She just said she wanted to make a comment, so maybe she can make her comment quickly.
Okay, great. Thank you. No, I just wanted to pick back up on your point about how Catholic missionaries or Catholic societies were not proselytizing in the Americas. I think that is something that is very important. A lot of my work is on the Anglophone Caribbean, but I'm trained in North America as well. And in fact, Tracy Hucks and I are both writing an article now on how there is this common belief that Africans in the United States lost their culture during slavery. And what we're arguing is it wasn't during slavery, it was in the period of the politics of respectability. It was the period after slavery. So I think it's an interesting point. And for me, looking at places like Jamaica and other Anglophone regions, there was that strong period of Anglicization that happened after slavery. So I would love to talk more about your thesis about the deities. And we just finished a book on Trinidad. And this time I wrote the section on Orisha. And it's very, very clear that the Yorubas who ended up in Trinidad as a result, like many Congos did as well, as a result of the liberated African migration, from Sierra Leone over to the Caribbean, they were definitely picking up the traditions of the Afro-Creoles that were already there. They were not engaging in Euro-Catholic traditions. When and where they adopted Catholicism and were engaging with Catholic saints, they were doing that based on the religious culture of the other Africans who had recently been liberated from slavery. So I just wanted to say that I think we actually need a new turn, especially in my field in religion, in this area, because many religion scholars do not do the kind of African Atlantic work, historical work that many of you all do as historians. So I just wanted to say that I agree. I don't know how I feel about the Catholic saints, totally across the entire Americas. I don't think that I have the authority to say that, but I do think that there is a foundation for that. And in fact, the book I'm working on now, I'm really looking at how Catholic Congo persons who ended up in Jamaica, Trinidad, the Southeastern United States, impacted the rise of Afro-Protestant traditions that are seen as a little less orthodox, like the Gullah religion and the Native Baptists and the Revival Zionists in Jamaica and the Spiritual Baptists in Trinidad. For me, it goes back to Congo Catholicism. That's always being mediated through indigenous Congo religion and spirituality, but that's a link that many folks have missed. They've done the work on how these Congo traditions have impacted places like Congo Catholic traditions, like Brazil and Cuba and Haiti, but not the Afro-Protestant world. And it was really being in the field, listening to the Revival Zionists in Jamaica, that turned me on to that. They have their oral history, and I was thinking, what they're saying is not true, right? This is not true. This is collective memory. But the more I dug and looked into it, I was saying, wait a minute. They were like, our ancestors brought this tradition from Africa. I'm thinking, no, they didn't. Revival Zion started in Jamaica in the 1860s. But the more I looked into the connection between Revival Zion and Kumina, which is a Congo-based tradition, I began to see that what they were saying was actually true. And that's what led me to Congo, including Catholic Congo. So anyway, I probably will want to talk to you more about it, but I just wanted to affirm that there is this belief that Africans just lost all their culture in the United States during slavery. And I just don't see the basis for that. It was after slavery that the missionaries were like, we have to go down there and save these heathens and teach them to be good Christian citizens. That's when all of the loss of culture, African culture, really, really took hold. So thank you for your presentation, and maybe hopefully we can talk in other contexts about this.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. Just a brief comment here, which is that the 1880s to 1920s was the low point for any culture that wasn't anchored in Western Europe. All the American colonies began to pass legislation or to reinforce colonial legislation that would suppress especially any manifestation of an African religion. And it's true that in the colonial period, and especially this is true in the Spanish colonial period, that this wasn't an issue for them. It became an issue, as you say, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Okay, I also have a comment here from Batsi Batsikama in the chat. So let me respond to that. He says the problems of conflict of viewpoints about Alfonso I was made after Quimpervita's death. This is not, I guess that's not anthropological question and not historic one. It is very important to search more about Alfonso I and discuss on him. Well, let me just say that I've done what I can do as a historian and a person with archival experience to find as much as I can about Alfonso. There are going to be gaps. There are very much gaps. One of the things that ironic of it is that Alfonso clearly wrote with an agenda of his own, and he's the only source. So what we know about Alfonso is what Alfonso has told us. We don't really have much in the way of outsider impressions of him at all. And to the degree that his letters were written by him and how he shaped them or so on, that's an issue that is one of those things that historians will perpetually grapple about because there's not a clear-cut answer to it. As far as the attitudes about Alfonso, that's interesting that actually the question of the burial of the mother comes up before 1706. It comes up in 1685. That's when it comes up in writing. I'm not sure when it came up originally. And what's interesting, though, is that histories of the Kingdom of Congo that are anchored on oral traditions that were circulating in the early 17th century, somewhere along the way in the early 18th century, Alfonso becomes the founder of the kingdom for all intents and purposes. And Nimi Alukini or Lukini Luanimi sort of disappears from the oral record. And I think he's probably been restored to some degree by the work of Jean Cuvelier. Jean Cuvelier is a very important part in connecting and creating, in many respects, oral tradition. But Cuvelier himself was very much affected by the oral traditions that he received in writing, actually, from Petula Boko and Lievan Sakalobuku. Both of them had written texts in 1910 and in 1912, giving origin traditions of the Kingdom of Congo and describing the population of the country by the clans, which became then his core idea of how Congo was founded. And he tried to marry that to some degree to the written traditions that we had from the 17th and 18th centuries about the founding of the country. So these are all really interesting questions, and it tells us a lot about how oral tradition works and how written documentation works as well. So do I have another? I think that that Patricio Batsikama also had a question. He's asking me about Mpanza Lumbu. We're not rebels, he says. Mpangya Lungu were rebels. So there are a number of orthographies in Alfonso's letters concerning this particular group. And we could argue for days over whether it's Panzua or Pangya. I don't think we'll come to a resolution on that. And I know that in addition to your work on this, we also have the work of Igor Sakala, who has argued that the Mpanza Lungu, he gives them a specific location and discusses that possibly Mpanza Lungu were actually adherents of Alfonso's brother, whose name was Panzu, and that these were people who were left over. I take that proposition seriously. It's quite possible that would be the case, although we should note that this particular group of islands seemed to have been a problem for the Kingdom of Congo from the 1490s onward, and so it wasn't strictly related to that. But again, this is another interesting thing. Okay, also I get from Batsikama, Kufwa Kwamfulu is code in Lemba society. I didn't know that, Bumpatia society. The correct name would be Kufwa Kiamfu. Okay, which means the laws have died. Fu means law in Lemba society. Okay, he's also trying to respond to Yeno Matuka. Okay, so go ahead. That's an interesting take. I'll take a look at that. You want to say something more? Go ahead. Unmute yourself. And
No, the first question, the response you made, the first question is not for you. I'm trying to respond. Bruno passed.
I
He
see.
talked about after Kimpa Vita, the king Afonso Primeiro. People disagree about him. One thinks that Afonso Primeiro is not a good man, and there is other people think that Afonso was a good man. This question begins after the Kimpa Vita death, because after you explained very well when you talk about the Panza Lungu and the rebels, Panza Lungu and Afonso I about the succession after the death of Jean I. This is the historical reality. We can find it in the letters that Afonso I made. This is the reality of that at the time. But the conflict between image of the king Afonso I come after the death of Kimpa Vita. Why? Because one side defend the local religion, another side defend the Catholic religion. And this conflict, je peux parler en français là parce que
John Thorton comprend bien le français.
Non, vous allez le traduire.
D'accord, je vais traduire.
C'est quoi? Ouais, j'essaie un peu de répondre à Bruno, parce que la question de kimbanguisme, de tokoïsme, et le conflit qu'il y a sur l'image de Afonso Ier, est venu après la mort de Kimpa Vita. C'est une question historique.
And was saying that churches like the Toko Church and the Kimbangu Church have image on Afonso Ier, c'est ça? And that came after the death of Kimpa Vita.
Sure. Et le problème aussi, quand on dit par exemple que Don Afonso Ier avait tué sa mère, c'est pas ça. Ça c'est une question de Kimpasi et de Lemba, c'est pas historique.
And when they said that Kimpa Vita, and this of going to John Johnson, that Afonso killed his mother. Just when they said that it is not true, because this had to do with Lemba and the Kimpasi.
Of course. Il y a en Banzakom, il y a un intérêt là où on dit que non, c'est la sépulture de la mère de Don Afonso. Et le lieu est appelé Donampolo. La mère de Don Afonso ne s'appelait pas Donampolo.
Just, when you go to Mbanza Congo, there is a place where they say that that belongs to the mother of Don Afonso, but it is not the case. Just there are some misunderstandings.
Bon, le problème c'est quoi? À l'époque de Don Afonso Ier, Thorton a bien décrit ça. Bon, c'est lui qui a essayé un peu de traduire. Il a créé une cité, une ville avec des écoles, avec des églises.
Thorton has addressed this question so well in his book, because this is the person who created some schools and even churches in Mbanza Congo.
Et à l'époque, je vais terminer, à l'époque, Mbanza Congo était divisé. Il y avait une partie européenne où il y avait des écoles, des églises. Il y avait l'autre partie qui n'ont pas adhéré à cela. Donc, c'est conflit.
And again, just Mbanza Congo then was divided in two major parts. Another part which was civilized, where the schools and this and that, and the other parts didn't have that.
Et ce conflit a pris une autre configuration après la mort de Kimpa Vita.
And that took another impetus just after the
et finalement, pour terminer, aujourd'hui, en Mbanza Congo, les chercheurs, quand ils vont, ils demandent les gens, ils demandent tout le monde, mais tout le monde n'est pas détenteur de la tradition orale.
And what is so sad that many just scholars, when they go to Mbanza Congo, they want to ask everybody, but
No,
everybody doesn't know. Just
no. La garde de la tradition, c'est pas n'importe qui.
Voilà. Il faut que ça soit à la réunion de la l'association.
Donc là, pour terminer, donc j'appuie l'idée de John Thornton dans son discours, c'était bon. Et ma question, c'était justement pour ça, sur ça. Il faut réécrire l'histoire. Il faut réécrire, il faut faire d'autres recherches sur Don Alfonso Ier. Parce que cette personnalité royale a vraiment aidé au développement du royaume du Congo à l'époque.
And much research needs to be done on Congo just Alfonso I. Why? Because this fellow just has contributed a lot on the development of Mbanza Congo. Merci beaucoup, mon frère. Thank you very much. Thank you, John. Thornton.
Yes. Well, I don't know that I can respond to all of that, frankly. And I see that Mr. Yaya has a question. Bruno, do you have a question, Bruno?
Bruno, do you have a question? Just
No,
Yaya, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Yes, my question to John Thornton is that what is the source of inspiration for him to write a book about the Congo Empire? And by what manner and what's the purpose of writing the book was pushing him to publicize all of that? I don't know if you get the question.
Well, possibly I do. I'll respond to what I understand your question to be. I'm glad that we finally got a connection that allowed you to speak intelligibly. So, well, my interest in the Kingdom of Congo goes back to the very early in my life, when I was probably in high school, and I learned of the Kingdom of Congo. It was not easy to do that in the United States in those days. There wasn't very much written on it. I was fortunate that I lived in a university town at that time, and I was able to access a university library, and also that I had already knew how to speak French. So, well, I can say that I was interested in African history in general, and I had to decide, obviously, a place to concentrate on. And one of the things I wanted to do was I wanted to ask the kind of questions that were being asked of European historians, things about the changes in demography over time, or the relationship between rural communities and urban communities, and so on. And I wanted to do this in a reasonably remote pre-colonial period. And the thing I realized, I mean, this is going to sound very unromantic, but I realized that the Kingdom of Congo had really a lot of documentation that would possibly allow me to answer those kinds of questions. And so that's how I became interested in it initially. Now, obviously, your initial interest then leads you to all manner of other things. And I become much more interested in the Kingdom of Congo, I guess you might say, in a topic in its own right. I had the misfortune of not being able to visit Central Africa or the Kingdom of Congo until I was in my 50s. I think I first visited in 2000. Oh, now I can't remember. That's another sign of age, I guess. But in any case, I remember that I wanted to kiss the ground when I got off the plane, because I had dreamed for years and years during the whole Angolan Civil War and everything that I would get the chance to go to Mbanza Congo, just to see the place. I used to have dreams about it, totally unlike the actual place, because I became very caught up in that whole question. And I mean, I can't say that I've dedicated my entire academic career to the Kingdom of Congo, because I've written many other things about the rest of Africa and about the African diaspora. And much of that has to come with my situation as being an American. living in a country which has a particular relationship to Africa and to Africans and people of African descent. And so that all of that is tied up in my motivations for becoming, for choosing the specific historical topics I engaged in. But then once you get into this thing, then it takes on its own life, and you follow up the things that you find interesting, and I guess that's kind of the way I do. I mean, I hate to say that I don't have really a well-directed academic career. I sort of, jump when I see something that looks interesting, I'll look at that and then move to something else. So I did, however, I published a book in 2020 called The History of West Central Africa to 1850. I called it my guilt book because I had collected so much information about so many parts of Central Africa, and I had so many unpublished documents and archival documents. I said, I have to just put this all together, so at least I can have a statement that uses all the material I have. And so that's what I did. I can't say that I entirely enjoyed that project, just because I felt like I needed to fill in all the gaps and all the edges, and I didn't have equal interest in every area. But I'm a historian. It's not difficult to get me interested in something. So that book came out that way, and I hope that this book will serve people as a sort of a guidebook. It's written as a very conventional sort of history. It's kings and battles history that's not very fashionable these days. But I thought also it's really helpful to have that sort of chronologically organized narrative history for Central Africa, for nothing else, because very often African history isn't written that way. It's more written in ways that don't follow what we might consider a traditional model for history. So I thought it was good to do that kind of thing. So there you have the project.
John, maybe this will be the last question, for the sake of time. Tatajan Sangu, okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Just a short question. Lukeni Lwanimi, that's to Professor Thornton. Lukeni Lwanimi is believed to have founded the Congo Kingdom. Any idea where he had come from? So he wouldn't have just appeared just out of nowhere to build a kingdom. So any idea where he had come from?
So the tradition circulating in the early 17th century, when he appears by name, draws him from the little kingdom of Vunda across the river, Vungu across the river from, well, I guess it would be Pembakazi. I mean, his reign begins in Pembakazi. And then from there, he makes various alliances and so on that build up the kingdom. And that's a long story. I have that story in my book. It's a revision of what I've done before. It's sort of my last word on this, but I'm very conscious that there's a lot of information in the 17th and 16th century sources that maybe it's known to us, and I've even read it, but I haven't necessarily put all of it together. I do feel very much that I would love to have more people doing this kind of work, because I'm recognizing that, as anybody, I have a single vision of things, and it takes somebody challenging me in a serious way in order to make me change that. When Igor Sakala challenged my demographic reconstructions, it forced me to revise the history of the Kingdom of Congo. I just published an article on that, and on the basis of, in part, responding to Igor's challenge, I had to raise my estimate of the population of the Kingdom of Congo from about 600,000 people to over 800,000 people in 1623. Now I had new documentation that assisted me in doing that. But I mean, that's an example. Fortunately for me, there's always been Wyatt McGaffey, who disagrees with everything I say. Maybe not. I mean, there's really, you get far more help from your enemies than you do from your friends. And Wyatt is by no means an enemy of mine, but he and I have not shared the same perspective on the question of the Kingdom of Congo. So I would like to say I welcome challenges, although really I dread them. But that's kind of it's fun being an expert and even being widely acknowledged as a prominent expert, but it's also kind of lonely in a way, and I really enjoy a good good, well-structured argument. I may not like it, and I may feel that I've won it or lost it, but that's what moves us forward. Francois Bontinck once told me when he was disagreeing with, he says, "Du choc des idées jaillit la lumière." I thought that was a very appropriate statement. Maybe it's not original to Bontinck, but Bontinck was sort of everybody's grandfather. For those of you who knew him.
John, I think you have already said it, but just in the history of African theological discourses, just of the last maybe 50 years, some of the prevalent terms include acculturation, assimilation, liberation, and inculturation. How would you just use those terms in the context of your work, just historically speaking? Just
oh my goodness. We have another hour here. Yeah, I mean, well, this is what my work is all about. I mean, I came to American history through African Americans. And I was an athlete in my youth, and I had a lot of athletic friends. I ran 400 meters and 800 meters. Those are events that are highly populated with African Americans. And, I sort of joined in that community in a way. And that's, so I often think about the African diaspora as I'm writing about Africa, but at the same time, it's really important to talk about Africa in its own terms. And then go from there out. So I go in and out, back and forth. And I think terms like assimilation and acculturation and so on, these are terms that are helpful. I don't use them very much in my own work. One of the things I would like, my goal is that my work is to be accessible to a high school teacher who didn't have a very good collegiate education. Because I think that this is where one makes an impact, which is to say, if a high school teacher can read my work, understand it, and convey it to her or his students, it will have a bigger impact than anything I can write on my own. I have to sort of write academic history for academic historians. I want to at least make it possible. I have a niece who actually teaches history in high school. And so I often bounce ideas off of her. Because it's helpful to work with it. I work a lot with high school teachers precisely so I can both myself understand where they're coming from and what they know, and also try to shape what I do in such a way that at least it's accessible to them. And which is, by a long way of saying, is that I really try very hard to avoid terminology that's not in common use at the level of the high school, not the high school students, but the high school teachers. And I know that high school teachers in the United States range widely in terms of what their intellectual culture is. Some of them might as well be university professors. Others of them are almost on the edge of rote learning kind of thing. So, but that's sort of where I want to make my inroads, and to try to get the curriculum guidance in the United States to pay more attention to Africa, that kind of thing. And so I serve on committees, and I do public work that I can do. I do a lot of work with media as well. I've done shows with Henry Louis Gates. We've been advisors, Linda Haywood, my wife, and I've been advisors to Louis Henry Gates for the last 15 years. And that particular medium is a great way of getting things out. You have to compromise a little bit on the rigor of what you do to make it happen, and you have to do it in such a way that that you use the media correctly. There's television and so on. We present things differently in that environment. So all of those are things that I work with museums. We've worked with Linda and I worked with the Smithsonian. We worked with the Jamestown Museum to try to get the African presence, properly situated.
Thank you. I think we just came to the end of this great meeting. John, we don't know how to thank you. You're such a blessing to us, and thank you for your support to Congo Academy. And just let us really, just wherever we are, just to give.
Well, I want to thank everybody here for the Congo Academy being in existence, which to me is an amazing thing.
Thank you, Tata John. Just in the Congo, we say matondo to fiauki matondo. The next week, next month, as you know, we have this great conference on what McAfee And we're so just grateful for the feedback we have received. Great contributors. As you know that Wyatt McAfee, like John Thorton and John Johnson, they are among just really great students of African, Congo history, Congo cultures. And just we'll be sending information about conference very soon. And please just pass on the information to other networks so that we can be just many people just on October 30th. It will be a great session that will be starting from just 10 o'clock a.m. to 4 p.m. Just great people, just many people have responded that really they want to take just part to that big conference to celebrate, to honor the work of our own Professor Wyatt McAfee. Again, thank you, Tata John Thornton, just for the wonderful just talk. And wherever you are, just we wish you a very wonderful weekend, you guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye to everybody.
Bye-bye. And thank you, Bachikama, just from Portugal. Bachikama is a good friend of mine and just working with his base in Luanda, where just he works with La Présidence, and also he teaches just professor at just at Tokoisi University, a good friend of ours. And as I said earlier, his grandfather was a good friend of John Johnson and Wyatt McAfee. Just thank you, Bruno, and thank you, everybody. God bless. Bye-bye.